It's great to see you today. It's cold and foggy, so that just means one thing: summer is here. And so I want to say welcome to those of you who are worshiping with us online this morning as well. It's great to have you joining us through this means. On February 20th, there was a hockey game held in Boston between players born in Canada versus players born in the United States. It was not the Olympics. It had nothing to do with the regular NHL hockey season. It was a made-up tournament with a made-up trophy for whoever would win. The organizers invited players from 4 countries to attend: Finland, Sweden, Canada, and the U.S. And as the tournament progressed, the Canadian and the American teams ended up in the final game to determine who would win this completely made-up tournament. While all of this was happening, something started to go on up in here in the political world. Comments about Canada becoming the 51st state and a sassy response from the Canadian Prime Minister all started to create a hubbub up here. While down here, players from Canada and the U.S. were going to play a hockey game against each other. Meaning that when the teams laced up for that championship game, suddenly that game had more meaning than normal. Yes, it was a hockey game, and whoever scored the most goals would win a fake trophy, but there was a whole lot more going on in that game. Jewish writers, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, were incredible at telling 2 stories at once. They would tell a story about something going on here on the ground, but it also had another bigger meaning going on up here as well. We see this, for example, in the Exodus story. It's the story on the ground of a people from a certain group who've been enslaved in the country of Egypt. They were able to escape that slavery and were taken into a new country, given new land, and they were going to start living by a new set of rules which would tell something about their God. That was kind of going on down on the ground. But up here, it was a bigger story about a God who comes and frees his people from slavery, gives them a brand new commandments, gives them a brand new way to live, and gives them a brand new identity. It was the same story, but things were going on at different levels. The same is true in the story of Joseph. On one hand, down here on the ground, it's a story of some really mean brothers who took their youngest brother, threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery. That brother ends up spending serious time in jail and then rises up and becomes the leader of a nation who, in the end, provides rescue for his family. That's happening down here on the ground. Of course, up here, it's the story that points us to Jesus. That Jesus is the one who comes on down. He ends up kind of down in the pit. He gets raised up and he provides rescue for the very people who put him into death in the first place. It's one story, but it's operating on 2 different levels. Today, as we look in the story in John's Gospel, chapter 2, the same thing is going on. It's a story with things happening at 2 different levels. Let me start with today. We're just going to read the first 3 verses. John chapter 2. It's on page 1648 if you're using the Bible in the seats in front of you, or look it up online as well, or on your phone. I'd encourage you to follow along as we work through this story this morning. John chapter 2. I'll just read the first 3 verses. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place in Cana at Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Now, in these first 3 verses, John's telling us a story that's taking place in 2 kind of different dimensions. On the ground, he's telling us about a wedding in a small town where there was an extremely embarrassing situation unfolding for a groom and for their family. But he's also telling us another story, using words and language that had a long and deep theological history for the people of Israel, his Jewish audience. A wedding and wine. First, this story takes place at a wedding. Weddings in ancient Israel were not like our weddings here in North America today, where, heaven forbid we have more than a 15-minute ceremony, pledging our lives to each other in the presence of God and family and friends, and then we have a 2-hour meal, and then we're done, and we're out of there as quickly as we can. In the ancient Israel, picture singing and dancing eating and feasting, repeated day after day for a week. And there's no arguing about guest lists. If my third cousin comes, then my wife's third cousin also has to come on her side. There was none of that. The whole community was invited. And the groom and his family were responsible to have planned and accounted for hosting a celebration for everybody that lasted a week. It was a major undertaking. Also, this is taking place in an honor-shame culture. So when you host the community, your family's reputation is also on the line. You want everybody to leave saying, wow, what a great wedding. Wow, these are great people. And not leave going, ugh, that was a horrible wedding. These must be horrible people. This was kind of all that was at stake. But John is telling two stories on two different levels. This is not just about a week-long event in the community of Cana. There's more going on here in this story. For Jewish people, a wedding was the main image used to describe God's covenant relationship with his people. God is the groom, and he's wed himself. He's linked himself. He's pledged himself to his bride, Israel. And their marriage was marked by a covenant love, an everlasting love, where God would be faithful to his people no matter their faithfulness back to him. We see this in the language around the Ten Commandments, which was almost like wedding vows, kind of, here's the vows that we make to each other. And we hear it in the language that was so often found in the Old Testament, where God would say, I will be your God, and you will be my people. This is the language of weddings. There's also this powerful kind of metaphor captured in the book of Hosea, where Hosea's wife Gomer leaves him and has an affair, likely with many men, and yet God says to Hosea, go and find your wife and pledge your covenant love to her again. Go win back your bride, pay off the debt that she owes to her lovers, and then invite her to come back home and renew your love for her, your unfailing love. And God does this because he's trying to get Israel and Hosea to realize this is what it's like for God to be in a relationship with his people. They're unfaithful. They've chased after other gods. They've incurred significant sin debt. And so God says, I am going to come, and not only am I going to woo you back to me, I'm going to forgive you, and I'm going to remain true to my promise to love you with an everlasting love. So, John 2 starts with a story about a wedding in a tiny village of Cana with two unnamed people. The passage doesn't even tell the names of the couple who are getting married, but it's also a story about the wedding. And the God who has pledged himself to you and I as his people. Now, John also mentions in this passage the theme of wine. Wine was both the alcoholic beverage, likely less alcoholic than today's beer, and it was also the symbolic reference that kind of captured this image of heaven coming to earth. The image of abundance, the image of God's kingdom, the image of flourishing. Now, I know many of us grew up in traditions where alcohol was prohibited, and have any alcohol at all was a sin. I didn't grow up in a tradition like that. I grew up in the West, where, if you invite the pastor to a barbecue and he doesn't bring 6 beer, you kind of think he's being a cheap jerk. I know many of us, others grew in a different culture. And the Bible here, when it talks about wine, isn't talking about drunkenness. Not at all. It's painting this picture of God's kingdom where the soil is fertile. You plant seeds in it, and it gives forth plants, it gives forth wine, and you can eat from it. And it's more than enough to satisfy everything you need. It's the vision of flourishing, the world working as it's supposed to work, as God intended it to work, everything as it should be. And so to abuse alcohol, of course, would be to dishonor the gift giver to you and would be a sin. Let me just kind of go through some passages that capture this image of wine as a symbol of flourishing and a symbol of abundance. Isaiah chapter 65, starting at verse 17. This was written to people who were living in exile. The enemy had come in and gathered up the Jewish people and taken them back to their country. meaning that the homes that these Jewish people had built, the gardens that they had planted, they were no longer living in. And while they're in exile, God gives them this vision of a new heaven and a new earth. Isaiah 65, starting at verse 17, says this: "Behold, I will create new heavens and new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create. For I will create Jerusalem to be a delight, and its people a joy." Again, this is the language of love. "I will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in it no more." You might recognize that verse from the book of Revelation. It's because he gets it from here, from the book of Isaiah. "Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but only a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. He who dies at 100 will be thought a mere youth. He who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed." And listen to this: "These people will build houses, and they will dwell in them. They will plant vineyards, and they will eat their fruit." While these people are living in exile, God gives them this vision of what it is that he is ultimately wanting to do. That when his kingdom comes, when heaven meets earth, people rejoice in God's creation, and God will rejoice in his people. There will be a joy of the covenant that had been renewed between God and his people. There will be a time of gladness and joy together. People will live long lives. They will be healthy. There will be this sense of thriving. And the verse that probably stood out to these people in exile is that God says it'll be marked by, you build a house, and you're going to live in it all the days of your life. And you're going to go out and you're going to plant in the field, and it's going to bring forth bread, and it's going to bring forth wine, and you're going to have your fill of both. Where God is ruling and reigning, there will be thriving and there will be abundance. And the image is captured in this vision of both bread from the ground and also wine from the vine. This continues throughout the Old Testament. In particular, the prophets were filled with this image of wine being symbolic of God's flourishing and of his abundance. Joel chapter 3, verses 17 and 18 talks about the day when God dwells on his holy hill, and on that day the mountains will drip forth wine. Amos 13 and 14 says, "There's coming a day when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman, and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills. And I will bring my people Israel back. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They'll plant vineyards and will drink their wine." Did you catch the flourishing and abundant imagery here in Amos? He's like, imagine you're out there planting seeds in the garden, and someone is 10 steps behind you harvesting the fruit of what you've just planted. The ground is so rich. The soil is so fertile in God's kingdom that the grain is like popping out of the ground, and the wine is running down the mountains. Abundance, flourishing, life as it should be, where God is ruling and where God is reigning. And wine becomes the symbol that captures what God is ultimately wanting to do, where he's ruling and reigning. And he's giving this image in Isaiah and elsewhere to people who are in exile, knowing that their enemy is sitting back in the house that they built, drinking wine on their deck. So John chapter 2, the tiny village of Cana, Jesus shows up at a wedding where the groom had run out of wine. And there's a miracle that takes place. But this is not just about Jesus rescuing someone from an embarrassing social situation. This is about God coming to meet his people again and his vision for abundant and flourishing life for all of them. Let's keep reading. We'll come back. We'll start at verse 3 again. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, and this is great advice for all of us, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each one of them holding 20 to 30 gallons. So picture 500 to 750 liters of water. And if you went to a large Jewish wedding, it would be normal to show up and you would wash your hands and you would wash your feet. There'd be a process that everybody would go through to be ceremonial clean so they could enter in and enjoy the wedding. And Jesus said to his servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet," or the wedding planner, the host who was looking after all the details. They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside, or the groom, and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best for now." Now, for tea-toting Baptists, running out of wine doesn't seem like a big problem for a wedding. But for this, we just kind of go get some watered-down church juice and let the party continue. But for John, what he's describing in this moment is a desperate crisis. The crisis of running out. Remember, this is an honor culture. The reputation of the groom and his family is at stake. No doubt the bride's family is thinking, who is this guy? And is he going to be able to provide for our daughter? The groom's job was to plan and set aside enough money to host the community for an entire week and to make sure everybody's wine glass was filled for the week. And so whether he did bad math or more people showed up than he planned or his crazy uncle drank too much, he ran out. He ran out. He fell short. He could not provide what was needed. And no doubt people were starting to wonder, who is this guy? And what is he really like? But this story isn't just about running out of wine. It's also about all the ways that you and I put our trust in things that run out. The ways in which we go after things that we think will make us happy, give us peace, give us contentment, that ultimately run out and we fall short. And the experience of falling short is a human experience. We fall short as employees, not always doing the best job. We fall short as spouses, sometimes being selfish and forgetful, sometimes being tired or distracted. We fall short as children, relating to our parents, not caring for them well enough. And we fall short in our relationship with the Lord who saves us as well. We ignore his commands, we disobey, we go long stretches of time without prayer. We're ungrateful for the things that he's giving us, wanting the things he gave somebody else. We put our trust in things that will never make us happy and that will never satisfy our souls, but we just keep doing it again and again and again, even though we figured that out once in a previous chapter of our lives. All of us are kind of like Hosea's wife, Gomer. We've been unfaithful to the Lord, who's only been faithful and merciful to us. So when the groom runs out of wine, yes, it's a problem for him, but it also captures our problem too. For we, like the groom, find ourselves in a desperate moment because we cannot create this flourishing life on our own effort. We cannot find that kind of inside-out peace through anything that we do, even good religious things. And in this story, Jesus' mom recognizes the problem, and she sends Jesus to fix it. And Jesus steps in, and he takes the place of the groom. He takes over the responsibilities of the groom, and he solves the wine problem shortage. He asks the servants to fill it up with water. Somehow in the midst of them filling it up and the host of the wedding tasting it, it gets transformed into the very best wine that anybody had ever had. And in the larger story where God is wed to his people, looking to bring about his kingdom, marked by flourishing and abundance to a people who are continually falling short, Jesus comes and he stands in our place and provides for us what we are unable to provide for ourselves. This is a story about Jesus rescuing a wedding, but it's a story about so much more, and I hope that you can see it. How brilliantly John wants you and I to recognize all that Jesus is doing in this story. Look at verse 11 as he kind of sums up this miracle. This incredible story, the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. Did you see Jesus' glory in this story? How he's working at both levels here. How he comes to this moment, the God who longs to be you reunited with his people, the God who comes with a vision of abundance and flourishing and life everlasting here and now for the people that he engages. These people who've just run out. They've just come up short. They just simply cannot get it done. This story is about a wedding, but it's so much more than that. This is a sign, John says. This miraculous wedding is a giant billboard with cheesy fluorescent lights pointing to the reality that God's kingdom has come today for you and for me. The wedding, the time when God comes and meets with his people, it's here. It started. The covenant love that God does not quit on his people. He keeps calling us back as his prostituting wife. He's shown up in the flesh. And Jesus, who comes and stands in the place of the groom who had fallen short, has come for us. And he's come to reestablish his kingdom here and into eternity. Think of how broken our world is today. Think of how easy it is for all of us to be distracted and chase after things that we think will make us happy and give us joy. And it's ultimately the wine that runs out. Just think of how far our experience today is from the kingdom that Jesus has come to establish once and for all, where there's flourishing, where there's abundance, where there's life, where things work as they should. And to this broken world, Jesus shows up, and he's not carrying an $8 bottle of wine from No Frills. He shows up with quality and quantity wine provided in this miracle to remind us of the power and the life that is at his disposal to redeem and to rescue all life, to rescue all of us. And this story answers the question that maybe you've asked yourself. Is there hope for someone who's fallen short? Who chased after some things thinking it would lead to life, only to discover it ran out? It also answers the question that we long for in our hearts, which is, will things get better? Is there hope for us that God is going to do a new thing to restore and put things back together again so that we can experience that kind of flourishing and abundance here and now, not just someday? It's interesting to me that in this miracle, not everybody sees it. In fact, the only people, John says, that understood really what was going on and saw the glory and the beauty of this moment were the servants who did what Jesus asked them to do, and the disciples. The disciples that Jesus had just asked to give up everything to follow him. The disciples who now got a glimpse of the glory of God and what it is that God wants to do in them and through them. The disciples who had sacrificed everything and were now going to give these next years of their lives to helping Jesus' kingdom come on earth. And when they saw the glory, they believed. They trusted him even more. They said, yes, this is exactly what I want to be a part of. And for you and I today, as Christ's ambassadors, as his people, as his disciples, I hope that as you get a glimpse of the glory of Jesus in this passage, of his vision of abundance and life for you and I now and for other people, that it will only make something rise up in your hearts that says, yes, I want in. I'm even more committed to living this kind of life and seeing God do this kind of thing, drawing people to himself and giving them new life than ever before. Because the soil of God's kingdom coming is surrendered lives. Jesus knows that his flourishing life is birthed in the soil of surrender. This new life, this new breath that he breathes into us, that gives us new trust, happens in that moment where we say yes to him. Let me pray for us. Jesus, we thank you for this story. We thank you for this vision of the kingdom that is abundant and flourishing. And it stands out to us today. It stands out to us today because the world that we live in is broken and so unlike this vision of the kingdom. And so, Lord, as it stirs up in our hearts a desire to be a part of it, we pray that we would give our yes to you today. That we would give our yes to a life of obedience and a life of service and a life of sacrifice. That we'll make ourselves available to you in all areas of our lives. And that as we do, we'll just continue to see your glory come and your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.